Welcome to this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and against the ongoing occupation and genocide, a century in the making, and most recently horrifically accelerated just 1 month ago. Please come and go over the course of these 2 days, today and Monday, as you wish. Quick thank yous to Elon Dancy and Christy McGuire of the Center for Urban Education for collaborating to create this event, Nikaya Washington Butler, Kelly Runko, and Caitlin Zerker, and Fiona Seals for their tech support, my daughters, Cecilia, Carmen, and Satya, for quickly training me in social media, my dear friends and colleagues, Uju Agarwal and Lisa Ortiz, for helping generously in the shaping of these conversations, and everyone who helped to circulate this event widely as we were stalled by our institution. We had around 170 people registered before the email was finally released this morning. So you all are amazing, and we thank you all for being here today. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I'm very grateful to be welcoming Dr. Nadine Neber. Dr. Neber is a longtime activist and scholar. She is professor in the Gender and Women's Studies and Global Asian Studies programs at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she is the co-principal investigator of the Diaspora Cluster. At the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, she co-founded Arab and Muslim American Studies. Among numerous other awards, Dr. Neber was selected as an international fellow with the Open Society Foundation's Academic Fellowship Program to work with the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit University in Palestine in the areas of curriculum and research development. I note here that Israeli occupation forces raided Birzeit University in late September of this year, assaulting security staff, destroying property, and terrorizing and detaining students. And this was not a new practice. On October 11th, 2023, Birzeit University Union of Professors and Employees Occupied Palestine issued a statement against the occupying state's terror and genocide. And I'll read from the conclusion of that statement as part of welcoming Dr. Neber. We in occupied Palestine and all Palestinians have no illusions in the poetic dreams of the triumph of the pen over the sword, because the sword has cut too deeply into our flesh at the hands of an enemy who has been granted by the hypocritical international community and the destiny of imperial history to claim a monopoly on both the sword, that which acts to kill, and the pen, that which narrates the acts of killing. As intellectuals and academics working in occupied Palestine, we have to use our words, however futile they may feel in such critical times. We also have faith in the bold souls of our people, our resistance, and the triumph of freedom, and in our inalienable rights. We are not your passive victims. We have been murdered, maimed, and displaced by a settler state, driven by an ideology of insane hatred and bloody violence. But we will not be silenced. Our resistance shows us the path forward, and we remain steadfast, and we shall triumph. So in solidarity and in the spirit of academics standing unwaveringly against colonization and genocide, and with freedom, with our colleagues in Palestine, we're honored to welcome you, Dr. Neber.
Thank you so much, Sabina, Dr. Vaught. I'm just gonna jump right in, since you've asked me to, just provide information and as a teach-in style. So I prepared a presentation called 10 Anti-Racist, Decolonial, Feminist Things You Need to Know About Palestine. And it's gonna be quick. So if you're listening, I'll try my best to list the 10 framings that I'm putting forward, so that people can at least grasp onto those. And it's pretty easy to find and Google, if you weren't able to capture everything I said about each framing. So the first one is that Zionism, the movement that supports the creation of the state of Israel on indigenous Palestinian land, is a project of late 19th century European colonial expansion. So that's the first thing you need to know about Palestine, is that Israel was created out of the conditions of European expansion and colonization in the Arab region and North Africa at the late 19th century. It was a political ideology representing British imperialist interests in the region that planned to set up this state on Palestinian land. The indigenous Arab people of Palestine and their descendants, who today number 13 million people, it's important to look back to that mid-19th century moment when the project of Israel was in formation, that when we look at that land, it's important to remember that the majority of people living on that land were Arabic-speaking Palestinians with few ethnic minorities. 85% were Muslim, 11% were Christian, 4% were Jewish, which means that, Jewish people have indeed always lived on that land. They were a minority, and they were also part of the indigenous populations, being Arab Jews, Mizrahim Jews, Jews who were part of the traditions and cultures of the peoples of that land. The British then support the Zionist movement's aim to establish a Jewish state in Palestine against the will of the majority of the people living there. And the reason why that's important is when we look at who Israel was created for, that leads us to point 2, which I'll just go to point 2, and then I want you to please remember some of those numbers. So with point 2, Israel is a settler colonial state that is rooted and structured by a white European vision, meaning that it's a story of colonization and dispossession, a story of a history of, that when Israel was created, it was a catastrophe that entailed massacring 530 Palestinian villages, razing them to the ground in 1948, killing 15,000 people, and involving 70 massacres. And this is part of the story that we need to be uplifting, that this is a 100-year war on Palestine, not a situation that started on October 7th. 750,000 Palestinians became refugees at that moment of the creation of the state of Israel, which is now 7 million. And Israel, and with the backing of the US, deny them their internationally recognized right to return under Resolution 242. So when Israel was created, they took more than 78% of historic Palestine, replacing and I didn't mention that, well, how did, I missed this. I meant to say that when, in that period between the British Mandate and 1948, the British supported the migration of white European Jewish people to Palestine. And so then what you end up having is that Israel is created, they take 78% of Palestine, they replace the original inhabitants, Palestinian Arab inhabitants of that land, with primarily white European Jews. And so that process of the creation of the state of Israel was a process of ethnic cleansing and erasure, which is in continuity today with what we're seeing in Gaza. The history of Palestine is a battle over land and a battle over demography. It's a battle over trying to increase the number of European Jews and Jewish people and decrease the number of Arab Palestinians. So the third thing you need to know is that Israel is not only a colonialist state, it's an expansionist state, which means that as we see what's happening in Gaza today, continuing to expand its borders, it's hard to say, and officially Israel doesn't necessarily affirm its official borders because it's committed to continuing to take more and more Palestinian as well as Arab land beyond what we think of as Palestine. So Israel occupied, when Israel was created, Palestinians were supposed to get the West Bank and Gaza as their land, but especially after 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. So this has been the ongoing struggle of, and then you have the so-called peace process of 1994. And it's important to note, because this is a primary discourse that circulates right now, is that Palestinians don't want peace. They want violence. They want war. What we need to remember is that the discourse of peace itself is a colonial imperial discourse that that Palestinians refer to as the normalization of colonization. So it's like saying that peace is a cover for normalizing colonization. And what that means is that, you know, if we look to the Oslo Accords of 1994, if we just look to that period after the Oslo Accords, Israel took more land during the time of peace than it took earlier during times that the world recognized as times of war. And so that inspires that home demolitions, land confiscations, constant ethnic cleansing, constant displacement, massacre after massacre, inspires Palestinian resistance. And then we had the second Palestinian uprising of 2000, which came after the peace accords. And then during that uprising, you know, we didn't have a strong Hamas at the time. So it's important to remember that even when Hamas wasn't in power or strong on the land, Israel was still massacring Palestinians, but using other justifications. So it's important to just note then and pause when we say Israel is an expansionist state, point 3, that if you look at the number of displaced Palestinians now numbering 7 million, that number has grown exponentially within a short period of time, meaning within more recent years. It rises, especially between, say, 2002 and 2023. So we can move to point 4. Israel is an exclusionary Jewish-only state. So if you create a state and call it a homeland for Jews, it also officially means in law that it's a homeland, it's a Jewish state, meaning a state for Jews only. And so that helps us challenge the dominant discourse that that Israel is like the only democracy in the Middle East, that it's a democratic state, which you hear over and over in the US media, that how can you be a democracy if you're a state for only one group of people? How can you be a multiracial democracy, a multi-religious democracy? Because ultimately in Israel, Jews are privileged over anyone else living there, Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, which would mean that other people, Palestinians who still live inside present-day Israel, are positioned and treated as second-class citizens, as well as anyone else who's not Jewish, as well as anyone who's not white Jewish. So I think that's an important point for thinking about, for anyone interested in thinking about the logics and narratives that Israel and the US tell to justify the creation of Israel and even the existence of Israel, because it's often talked about as in terms of a haven for Jewish people who suffered the horrific Holocaust. But what we want to think about then is, what does it mean to create a state for Jews only? And how does that contribute? How does being an exclusionary state, how does that contribute to, reproducing violences that happen historically? It's going to be an inherently racist state based on segregation and displacement if it's a state for one group of people only by nature. The fifth point is that it's really important, even especially for people who are new to it and tend to understand what is happening now in Gaza as a situation of occupation. We often hear people say, end the occupation. But it's really important to remember that ending the occupation isn't enough. We need a decolonial framework. So what that means is that we need to call for decolonization and ending the occupation. So what's the difference? What's the difference between, so the fifth point is we need to call for a decolonial politics and end the occupation politics. What that means is, if you only say end the occupation, you're referring to a post-1967 politics. you're referring to, Israel should stop militarily, politically, and economically occupying the West Bank and Gaza. But what you're not saying is that there's actually a problem that's rooted in decades before Israel was occupying the West Bank and Gaza. And that's the reality of colonization, the creation of the state, which happened in 1948. So what it means when you say decolonization, what that allows you to do is it allows you to hold 3 groups of Palestinians in your framework. What I mean by that is, and so what I'm saying is that we need to pay attention to that there are 3 groups of Palestinians and not 1. If you say end the occupation, you're referring to 1 group of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who live in the place that's supposed to be Palestine according to the, global agreements, West Bank and Gaza. But what we're doing then is we're actually participating and complicit in the colonization of Palestine if we leave it there, even if unintentionally. So what this means is that you can be pro-colonization and against occupation. So let's talk about that. Who is left out from the end the occupation framework? It's the 7 million Palestinian refugees who were displaced and live all over the world today. Now, what we need to call for is the right to return for those people who are not allowed to return to their homeland. So that's the second group of Palestinians are the refugees. And the third group are Palestinians currently living within Israel. Palestinians who are indigenous to the land and did not leave or get displaced when Israel was created. Israel calls them Arab Israelis because of the commitment to erasing Palestinians off the face of the earth. So they refuse to call them Palestinians, but there's a large population. Palestinians tend to call them 1948 Palestinians. They live inside Israel and are treated as second-class citizens. So those are the 3 groups of Palestinians that we need to make sure are always at the table when we talk about freedom, liberation, social justice, solidarity. I'm actually just going to skip to my 7th point, which is Palestine is not an island. What does that mean? We often, in the US, solidarity often treats Palestine as if it's an island far away, that what we're in solidarity with are a group of people who are colonized by Israel. But we need to center that this is a project of the United States. It's a project of every presidential administration. It's a project of US imperialism. And it's a project that's part of an Arab regional context. So you really can't fully understand what is happening now if you don't take a couple minutes and look into Israel's relation to Syria, to South Lebanon, to the Sinai in Egypt, to the border of Egypt, to the Jordan Valley. And what you'll start getting a sense of is that back to the point of Israel as an expansionist state, that Israel has occupied South Lebanon for 20 years. It's occupied the Sinai, occupied the Golan Heights in Syria, as, stolen land from Jordan and sealing the water, drying out the Jordan River. And so this is also part of it's part of our solidarity is to, both stand against Israeli colonization and against US imperialism in the broader Arab region, and stand in solidarity with, if we're worried about, people on our campuses and who are the targeted communities, it's absolutely centrally Palestinians, but it's also, other people who are deeply connected and impacted by Israeli state violence and expansion. Number 8 is Israel's an apartheid state. I have a feeling people listening might already be familiar, and it's also something you could easily Google, what is Israeli apartheid? But it also is important because it helps us challenge the dominant discourse that continues to talk about, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, whereas that has not been possible for decades, since Israel continues to take more and more land in the part of Palestine that's supposed to be for Palestinians, which is the West Bank and Gaza, which is what we see today through, obviously, genocide we're talking now, but we're also talking about more than 200 Israeli settlements that exist in the West Bank and Gaza that have existed, and the transfer of 400,000 Israelis who are in the West Bank and have been living in different areas in the, quote unquote, Palestinian parts. So I'm just going to skip to talking about Gaza. The ninth point is that is a framework of a decolonial framework versus necessarily a anti-colonial framework. And what I mean here is that first, what we need to remember, I'm actually not going to go in. I mean, I'm assuming the audience understands that this did not begin on October 7th, which, in Indigenous studies framework, we might think of settler time, saying, the war on Hamas or the, Israel's war on Gaza. But if we go back to what I've been saying about a decolonial framework, it takes us back over 100 years. And then we could add to that analysis the context of Gaza itself, and that it has this long history, especially even if we're just talking about the last 16 years that Gaza has been under a blockade, 2.6 million people living in a 23/7 piece of land, cut off from the entire world, 80% depending on humanitarian assistance. As of 2021, the unemployment rate among the highest in the world for 16 years, plus 6 bombing campaigns. So this is what we're talking about with a decolonial time versus settler time. And then I'll just go to a little more about a decolonial framework that Palestinian scholars and activists have been insisting on, which is a response especially to the current dehumanization of Palestinians. So if you think about that, the Israeli defense minister called Palestinians in Gaza human animals, the response we're seeing from Palestine says, the US and Israel, from, scholar Rana Barakat, dehumanizes us. And then she says, we are not going to prove our humanity to those who have lost theirs. We are more than war and more than victims. And this is kind of this framing that the Palestinian feminist collective is also putting out around uplifting Palestinian life, Palestinian love, and challenging the reduction of Palestinians, even among activist movements, to just victims, or to tell the Palestinian story as a story of Zionism, which is, recentering Zionism as the center of the story rather than Palestinians and Palestinian life and love. The 10th point is that Palestine is a feminist and queer issue, which I could talk about for hours. And in a couple minutes, I think it's important just to uplift the long history, at least 75 years when, when Israel uses sexualized violence as a tool of colonization. And so that includes relying on both in discourse and practice. So when I say discourse, I mean something that Neda Elia documented in her book, say with military officers suggesting that the only thing that would deter attacks by a Hamas militant is knowing that if caught, his daughter or his sister would be raped. So what that discourse basically uses anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sexist, racist ideas that Arabs and Muslims are the most homophobic, sexist people in the world, and then twists it to say that, therefore, if you really want to punish an Arab, you sexually violate them, as if, sexually violating anyone wouldn't be the most horrific thing that you could do to someone or any community. And so what it does is it shifts the gaze away from the Israeli violence and puts the gaze on Palestinian and Arab and Muslim sexism and homophobia. And so we want to be aware of that. And and that's a huge discourse right now with like feminist and queer Palestinians being targeted and harassed for standing up against the genocide by, genocidal perspectives, saying, how could you possibly be against a genocide when you're queer and Israel, wants you, and your people are, want you dead because you're queer, etc. So now in praxis, what does this mean? It means that there is a long history here of Israeli sexualized torture of Palestinian women for the specific strategy of repressing resistance. There's a huge body of literature on sexualized torture in Israeli jails, not only of women. And then if we add the reproductive justice piece here, there's a huge body of literature on, if we think about this as colonization is a battle over demography, that you need to ethnically cleanse and replace the indigenous population with a new group of people, European Jewish people primarily, then one of the ways you do that is you target Palestinian birthing. So you have a huge history here of Israel targeting Palestinian mothers, and we see that right this moment in Gaza with the murder of children as a strategy for destroying future generations of Palestinians. We could just think of, the larger reproductive justice analysis, that denying people the capacity to parent, to protect youth, to protect children, denying caregivers and relatives the capacity to practice care and love and, birthing and family relations. Those are all reproductive justice issues, not to mention the Palestinian women in labor who are historically and repeatedly and consistently denied or delayed from reaching hospitals and forced to give birth at checkpoints. And we're hearing now that Palestinian women are, having C-sections without, without any anesthesia, just in the past few days, not to mention much worse horrors. Palestine is a queer issue. Many people already are familiar with this analysis that Israel uses this idea of Palestinian homophobia to justify colonization, white man's burden. But even more than that, Israel recruits and has recruited historically, and this is a state-led project, recruiting gay Palestinians as poster children of this idea of like Palestinian homophobia, which has the effect of dividing society and marginalizing queer people, because it equates queerness with being a traitor to your people. And so, queer Palestinians become conflated with, with siding with Israel. And Israel integrates that discourse into Palestinian society, which intensifies homophobia in Palestinian communities. And so again, if anyone ever hears discussions about Palestinian sexism and homophobia, you really can't talk about it without addressing the social disruptions that colonization has caused for 100 years into Palestinian communities. And then the last point, and really I gave a talk about this Wednesday and it's on YouTube, so I don't want to have people listen again. If you listen to the critical resistance discussion where I talked about Palestine as a people of color liberation movement in the United States. So the last point I'll put out in the last few minutes is a framework that we could call feminist anti-imperialist abolition. And what I mean by that is that, is that Palestine is a coalitional freedom movement for all of our communities. And we can just look to the links between, say, the shooting of Indigenous people by cops, by white supremacist vigilantes, all enabled by the state, by police, by mayors, by governors' offices, by officials, and nearly every one of these shootings that we've seen, even recently, torture of Black people, killing of Black people by the cops in Chicago, where I live, all enabled by governors, states' attorneys, by the state. And then you see that these same police have been, the police force in all of these cases are training extensively with the same Israeli military currently massacring Palestinians en masse. So what I'm saying here is that we need an abolitionist politics that goes beyond talking and challenging carcerality in and of itself and linking a politics to abolish prisons with a politics to abolish the military industrial complexes. They both together have got to go. Israel's horrors today are lines in the sand. They're a call, a reckoning to activists, to scholars who are either have moved in directions and forgotten about the aftermath of September 11th, when we had a anti-imperialist abolitionist movement that has dwindled, and we see more of a fixation on engagements with the state or obsessing over electoral politics. And what I'm really trying to say here is that, we might want to think back to that moment, that post-September 11th moment. I was part of the Insight movement, and we were part of many movements. It was a movement of many movements of people of color and Indigenous people connecting settler colonialism in the US to settler colonialist projects that are extensions of settler colonialism here, like the Project of Palestine, like Hawaii, et cetera, in different ways and to different degrees, and connecting those to, what we saw in 2020 when the Oakland police showed up with tanks and a SWAT team to pull out houseless Black mothers from a house where they were squatting with their children. And so we're seeing, this intensification, the militarization of the cops is what I'm talking about. And especially when, the US puts out the cry of war. We see every declaration of war escalates the policing of borders. It escalates the militarization of police. And all of that's happening right now with the genocide in Palestine. All of this is rippling out into all of our communities and all of our struggles. And so what we need to really think about then is, I said this a few days ago, that I have actually felt pretty heartbroken over the past few years about what happened to that. Why does it take a genocide for us to be asking about to be asking about the connection between settler colonialism and, and abolition? Why did it take this for us to be for people to be inviting me to speak again about that moment of the Insight movement, which was 20 years ago? And so I'll just say here, and we can put it in the chat, that and also all over, globally, in community with abolitionist movements globally, prisons are understood as as part of an anti-imperialist movement, recognizing that prisons are there to further, U.S. expansion and the movement of capital across the globe. So I'll just move now to putting in the chat a project that was just launched by the Palestinian Feminist Collective that I'm part of, and the Insight Palestine Force that was just revived in the past month, where we put out a call for a visionary public art action centering Hiba, whose image is behind me, and I carry her eyes with me. She was murdered by Israel with her 2 children. And we have created this poster to ask and call to action that her eyes and these posters are on every corner, in every part of every space in all of our lives, like a tidal wave, interrupting this genocide, interrupting everything, all the people who have been murdered and taken away from all of our communities. And that this is not a zero-sum game where I or others are asking us to say, that we have to drop everything else to prioritize Palestine, or to put our other organizing or scholarly work aside. And it's not a zero-sum game in terms of asking people to risk losing resources for their struggle because they've taken a stance against Zionism. We all need to recognize that the liberation of Palestine is woven through the freedom of all of us, and it's time to draw on our grief and our love and our rage and reckon with the limitations of our movements that treat Palestine as an exception, or create this progressive except for Palestine. And we really just need to step up and escalate in ways that are unimaginable, that we might not have ever, and we might not even, be able to picture the kind of stepping up that needs to happen to stop this bloody, horrific massacre upon massacre that we're witnessing, and then to just uplift that if none of us will be free if Palestine is unfree. Thank you.
Nadine, I am just so exceptionally grateful for you, for all your work, for spending time with us today, for teaching us. I hope you see with all the hearts coming up across the screen how much gratitude there is for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wish you all the best. And this is what we need to be doing. Teach-ins, in the playground, at the dinner table. And there's so much more to say another time's up, but people often ask, like, what can I do? You already know what to do. People are losing their jobs. Students are being targeted. Their lives are being ruined. Just go to whatever is happening in your little neighborhood or your campus and stand up for anybody around you who's trying to, stop this genocide and just show up for them. And it's, I think we all know what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take good
Should I
care.
just leave the Zoom now? Okay.
You can leave or stay,
Okay,
whatever.
I understand what you mean. That's how we are saying bye.
Yes.
Greatest thank you and gratitude to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, I welcome again, Dr. Mayorga, if you're here. Hello. Welcome again, everyone, if you just joined to this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and for the right to return, as Dr. Neber just reminded us, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide, a century in the making, and most recently, horrifically accelerated. Please feel free to join us to come and go over the course of these 2 days as you can, as you wish. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I'm really grateful to be welcoming Dr. Edwin Mayorga. Dr. Mayorga is Associate Professor in the program in Latin American and Latino Studies and Chair of the Department of Educational Studies at Swarthmore College. Among numerous other projects, he is the founder of Education in Our Barrios Project and created the Critical Education Policy Studies Group. An expert in critical curricula, we welcome Dr. Mayorga today to talk about teaching for a free Palestine, against colonization, occupation, and genocide, and across colonial projects. Dr. Mayorga, we're really so thankful for your contributions to our shared work today. And I will say I initially reached out to you because you shared the Zinn Project curriculum guide on teaching Palestine. I think both the history of colonization and the history of people, culture, language, knowledge, etc. So I'm wondering if you might jump in where you wish and help us think about what makes liberatory curriculum and pedagogy in these times.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina, and the Center for Urban Education and Pitt for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Can you all hear me okay? Just wanting to make sure. So I did want to also take a moment to, I'm speaking to you all from Haudenosaunee land here in Montreal, Canada, and where I typically reside with my family in the heritage and ongoing lands, unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape. So I wanted to just make sure that I recognize and acknowledge that, but also see it as an invitation to think about settler colonialism more broadly and in relation to Palestine. And I think more than anything, part of the reason, my motivations for sharing what Zinn Education Project had created, and there are so many, wonderful pieces of curriculum, is my own deep desire to thinking about how we teach through the weight of history, the weight of loss, of devastation. I will say also, just that, not as an aside, but I did also want to add that my heart goes out also to each and every one of you who are participating here as audience members and as speakers. This is a extremely difficult time for many of us. We've lost loved ones, or we are supporting and working with friends and colleagues who have, or perhaps they themselves have lost loved ones. And so I think we need to consistently and continually sit with that and think as educators as to what that means for us and what responsibilities we need to take on, not just as educators for social justice, but I think all of us as educators, not only in the formal classroom, but as parents, as community educators, as peers and friends. There's always this kind of pedagogical dynamic that we need to attend to and take very seriously, rather than kind of, be flip about it and seeing it as not, perhaps in some ways, not essential to when tragedy is happening in the moment, it feels difficult to stop and think, well, actually, we need to be teaching here as much as we are attending to the harm and the violence that that is being that we're witnessing, and for some of us experiencing ourselves directly. And so where does teaching fit into this is what motivates me, and motivates a lot of the questions that I'm thinking about. So in my commentary, I wanted to actually just kind of talk us through some of our kind of pedagogical kind of thoughts that I had. As there is no one, I know, Sabina, you and I are educators and deeply invested in that. And so I think we both, and many of us who are here know, right? There is no one silver bullet, this is going to save everyone kind of approach. So what I want to share are my thoughts on one potential approach that I've gathered in listening and staying attuned to what's happening and how people are talking about what's happening right now in and around Gaza. But also then thinking about my own experience as an educator, as well as an organizer and as a parent. How do all these three pieces, how do I navigate those things? And in particular, thinking about the ways that much of this feels, for those of us in North America, much of this feels as if it's something that is far away. And so we as teachers, I think it's critical for us to think about, how do we teach something that feels far away, or that it is safer for us to treat it as something far away, rather than actually stopping to look and attend to, in fact, it's right here, right? Whether it be through people and family and neighbors, or direct relationships that we have, or our own histories, right? Myself as a child of immigrants from Latin America and Asia, what in fact does this mean for us? What are the histories and ways that in which there are overlapping long loops of time and processes, and sitting with the atrocities that have shaped what in fact is happening to our own communities and our own loved ones, and seeing those connections and through points. And my hope is that in thinking about these steps that I'll talk through, is thinking ultimately about solidarity. What in fact does solidarity look like? How do we teach towards solidarity? And how do we facilitate that for ourselves, as well as the young people, or whatever age group of person you want, the person that you are trying to reach and engage with, whomever that is. What's the henceforward in terms of teaching towards that, rather than the assumption that I think that there's just, I think we sit with a kind of pessimism that things will never change. And I'm trying to I'm inviting us to flip the script on that, and to really think about, actually, solidarity is possible. And we in fact have had long histories of solidarity, but they have often been histories that are denied to us. So how do we unpack some of those things? So I'm also taking some of this from some of this work around brave community, brave conversation that Jadine Denoves has developed. And so, I'm taking some of those strategies around, and she recently, I'll share in a moment, just she recently shared a piece around why we struggle with, how do we better facilitate talking about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, what's happening now, but also situating it historically when we're in classrooms. So I'll share that link in a moment. So my colleague Jen Bradley at Swarthmore, who had pointed it to me, and that was also coming from Adrienne Marie Brown. So want to cite our sources. But Denoves talks about the idea of pre-work. So you, in your context, right? And so And Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz talks about this notion of the archaeology of the self, which I think is critically important in instances where we are looking at deeply controversial and deeply polarized kinds of catastrophes and events that are happening in society, in the world, globally. And so really, before we even engage and start to contemplate engaging our students in thinking about that, what kind of self-work do we need to be doing? And that includes both kind of social, emotional, our own kind of well-being and what we are in a position to take on, because teachers are humans too, contrary to some students' beliefs. And but alongside that, then grounding us in what history do we know, what history has been denied to us of this particular conjuncture and moment. And more specifically, zeroing in on Palestine is, and there's a lot of conversation at I'm at the American Studies Association conference, and so there's a lot of conversation happening right now. And one of the important points that I had been thinking about and was affirmed actually in just the talk I was just at just before joining all of us here, the question of Palestinian exceptional, like it's treated as this exception rather than situated within history and time. And so when I'm reading articles about, settler colonialism is not an appropriate and accurate description of what's happening. I think it was a piece in the Atlantic. I bristled at it because I'm like, well, what are we talking about here? What's our understanding of what settler colonialism or other forms of imperialism and colonialism and empire that are, circulating in the larger kind of landscape and discourse? How are we thinking about that? And I think that, how do we step away from that ourselves and starting to think about, okay, we need to know more, right? I need to know more because this is not that's not in our textbooks here in North America, typically. It's not in everyday conversation. It's a very, the misinformation, the very kind of one-sidedness of conversation leads us to having very let me call it malnourished understandings of the entire situation. And so we foreclose the possibility of, we just describe it as, oh, well, that seems kind of like a landmine of a conversation. There's too much, it's too complex of an issue to wrap our heads around. And that to me seems to be a kind of cop-out rather than actually jumping into it as teachers to say, this is critical. This is what's happening in our world right now. And there's so many deep connections to the past. And so we need to do deeper dives, engage in conversations ourselves before we even start to think about it. So that's step 0, right? Like before we even get to, planning and thinking about something. And I've got maybe, I guess 4 more steps. So step 1 then is once you've done that kind of, as you're doing that self-work, and I don't think, that work never ends per se. And we have to be comfortable with knowing that work is ongoing. And so at some point you reach a point where you feel that you're better prepared to engage others in your students in these kind of conversations or whomever you're trying to reach. So step 1 then is really to do similar kind of grounding work with them, asking ourselves, if it's our classrooms, what kinds of practices, of everyday practices of living and moving at what Adrienne Marie Brown and others have talked about as moving at the speed of trust. Have we created a context in which having a conversation about something that is seen as very polarizing can be easily seen, or not easily, but just seen and understood as, yes, this is complex, but we trust each other enough to engage in a conversation and multiple conversations, deeper study of an issue, and taking into, being accountable to, while this may not be directly something that I am involved in as a young person, I see that as a member of this world, we are all implicated in it, and what then is our accountability, right? And so really thinking about what, in fact, those things, kind of grounding ourselves in that. I also think, I want to point to one other thing here in this step is um, the importance of practicing as we are talking about issues and people being directly affected is that and I think it goes back to this point around exceptionalism of Palestine rather than seeing it in context, is how important it is to not to treat all life, right, all living beings as sacred. And so we often talk about here in this context in particular, right, we're talking about the importance of humanization. And I say yes to that, but also stretching us to think about all living things, right? As when we're talking about land back or ecosystems, entire environments, right? We're talking about living entities, living things on the planet in relation to humans, right? So I'm, kind of taking this more ecological perspective on it, that it's an entire ecosystem that we are a very fragile ecosystem that we're talking about. So when colonization happens, not as an event, as Patrick Wolf reminds us, but as the structure, that everything is impacted by that ecosystem. We feel it in our bodies, we feel it in our spirits, but we also feel it in the very land in which we are walking on. The water, who has access to that, who does not? And so there's all this kind of environmental piece to it. So we need to, from my perspective, as we're grounding ourselves, continue to remember that life, in fact, is sacred. So that's step one. We did step 0, step 1. Step 2, thinking about, okay, when we are actually engaging in these conversations, how do we support what happens next, is what Denoves talks about. In what ways have we, again, moving at the speed of trust, how are we emotionally centering ourselves? How do we create and invite inquiry and question without, in ways that colleagues of mine at an organization in Philadelphia called Creative Praxis describe as being full of value but free of judgment. What kind of space does that require for us to invite, open up questions, allow students, who have a kind of general curiosity about what's happening, to ask questions in a way that doesn't feel like they are about to instigate or initiate a question, or I'm sorry, an issue or contention and strife around it, but rather needing to want to learn more and opening up that space. And then the other piece to this in terms of supporting what happens is thinking about practicing how we sit with diverging views. What in fact needs to happen in order for us to sit with views that will sometimes put, just kind of make us kind of bristle. How do we sit with that? How do we stay in the conversation, protect ourselves, but then at the same time, open to pushing back, to listening, and in being engaged in that, and holding on to what we believe to be your particular approach. Step 3 then is thinking about modeling bravery and accountability. So things, in conversations as educators, when you open up these kinds of conversations, there's a chance it's going to fall off, run off the rails. And so how do we bring us back, right? How do we listen attentively when we name, okay, there's a tension happening here, or some of us are starting to escalate our voices and we as facilitators identifying that and not dismissing it, but rather thinking about, well, let's step back and think about what's behind that, right? Maybe we feel very impassioned about our perspective, or maybe you feel harmed by a diverging perspective, or maybe it feels like we're kind of rudderless in what this conversation is, or this area of study and conversation is where it's going. And so being prepared to, like, how do we bring people back, right? And ourselves back into the conversation, holding each other accountable and helping us to continue to be brave in these difficult conversations. The final piece in step 4 is moving to action. So I think one of the key things, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the importance of disrupting the cynicism. And I appreciated Nadine's point about the normalization of colonization and the pretenses of neutrality. It happens, right? We have these serious conversations, and then it kind of ends, and so people are just elated it's over, rather than stopping to think that conversations and study is actually the beginning. It's about stopping to think about, well, what's the henceforward, right? What is next? And where do we fit in that larger global next? And so that's where I think we can move from disrupting cynicism, disrupting that normalization, and moving towards solidarity. And I also want to just problematize, and this is where I'll end, I think, is we want to problematize as well what we mean by solidarity, because colonization has also framed what we are even thinking about as possible in solidarity, right? And so thinking about what solidarity looked like in Palestine 2 decades ago, 4 decades ago, right, means something very different to what solidarity means to us right now. And whether or not we have even, it absolutely should be centered in what's coming from Palestine and the Palestinian people, but then in relationship to the rest of us, right, who are outside of the actual geographic zone, how are we attending to emerging definitions of solidarity? There are different needs, right? And the fact that everything is on social media and here we are online having this conversation, it means that solidarity, like even this, like how do we see this space that we have, that you all have facilitated here, as an opportunity, a window for solidarity work, and meaning making and relationship building. And that's different from, even 20 years ago when I was teaching, second graders, or we were talking about September 11th, right? It was a different time. And so there are different moments, and yet there's that deep desire for connection, right? For support. And so how do we channel those things into our contemporary moment to not have predetermined or foreclosed definitions of solidarity, but actually saying, you know what, we need to stop and think about what in fact does this look like for us right now, right? And how then ultimately, and I'm sorry, I lied. I had one more thing to say. And how do we move then from solidarity to radical kind of futures, right? Transformative futures, because that too has been shaped by colonization, right? So when we're saying land back, for example, in indigenous movements, native movements, and I think similarly here, it does not, it has a different definition, a different meaning to us as to what this means and what's possible. And then thinking beyond that, it's like, okay, this is what has been kind of defined as possible, and maybe I'll say the word palatable, for structures of power, to say, okay, yeah, we could do this. But really stopping to think about, well, what's just beyond that? What, perhaps a more just world, a more caring and loving world is what's desired. And we don't maybe have the language. Because of colonization, we don't have the language to name and visualize it quite yet. But let's be in that conversation. Let's talk about what that transformative future looks like, because there will come a day, and I hope very soon, right, where there's a ceasefire, right, just to start. And so, well, what's the work after that? Because in many ways, that is just the beginning. And so, I invite and welcome us as educators to really stop and think, and invite our students to think about what is that, let's stop, let's end the violence, but and at the same time be in the process of thinking about a more just and loving future. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Edwin. Do you have a couple minutes? I know we had a 4 o'clock. Okay. I want to reflect back to you and to everyone on this call that I always appreciate how deeply collective you are. And even in this conversation, sort of, the ease, because it's your regular practice with which you weave in so many other people and traditions, and sort of modeled for us in teaching us, also modeled for us a way to teach collectively, even when we're, one person in a conversation. So I appreciate that very much. I also appreciated two things. Well, I appreciate everything you said, but two things you said about solidarity, I think, at the beginning and at the end. And yeah, you reminded me of, the famous James Baldwin remarks when he said, of course we're demanding the impossible. That's all we've ever done. And that impossible, if we are we there?
Can you all hear me?
Yes. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
I'm sorry. Yeah, now I can hear you. So you were saying, Sabina, I'm going to stay off camera just because I think it's
a hotel thing.
there's something happening here. Yeah, I'm sorry, all. I'm sorry, y'all.
Probably here too. I think just that idea that we do the impossible by doing it together.
Yes.
The other thing I heard you say that many people have been in conversation about is that solidarity is about the moment, and I really appreciated you pointing to the way in which solidarity with Palestine looks different over time, and that in this moment there's a very particular, we're being asked in very specific direct ways to repost, to repeat chants, to put our bodies out in rallies and protests. So very specific, consistent requests for kinds of solidarity, to have conversations. And I think you modeled that. So I just appreciate your sort of pedagogy, how to meta pedagogy for us today, and really grateful for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that that's been communicated. Because you sometimes sit in the Zoom box and you're wondering, who am I communicating what I hope to communicate? And I think definitely that's it. It's about our practice, and it's an everyday practice. So I appreciate that. I did also want to take one last moment too. There was a statement that that Dr. Subanianama and others have put together that I'm deeply appreciative of being invited to participate in that statement. But an Educators for Palestine statement has been crafted, and we are gathering signatures from educators both in higher ed and beyond. So I believe that's the right one in the chat. But definitely want to invite those of you who are on here to join us in that if you are supportive of that. I think much of my remarks are about the classroom, and that's how deeply entangled it is with what's happening beyond the classroom. We as educators, and much of my work as an activist educator has been about understanding that the struggle for justice doesn't end when the school bell rings. As a longtime New York Collective of Radical Educators member, and so in what ways are we both active in our classrooms, but also stretching ourselves and being active in our communities? So I definitely want to encourage people to sign on if they're so moved.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for your work.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your session. And definitely come back Monday, because there's some awesome, dope people coming in on there too. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone, to this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right to return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide, a century in the making. Please, of course, come and go, join us as you can or wish over these 2 days. We have 5 people joining on Monday. I want to share quick thank yous again to Elon Dancy and Christy McGuire of the Center for Urban Education for collaborating to create this event, Nikaya Washington Butler, Fiona Seals, Kelly Runko, and Caitlin Zerker for tech support. My daughters, Cecilia, Carmen, and Satya, for quickly training me on social media. My dear friends and colleagues, Uju Agarwal and Lisa Ortiz, for helping generously in the shaping of these conversations, and everyone who helped to circulate this event widely as we were stalled by our institution. We had around 170 people registered before the institutional email finally went out this morning. So you all are amazing, and we thank you for being here today. I am Sabina Vaught, and I am so very grateful to be welcoming my friend and someone whose absolute, unwavering dedication to liberation is just an extraordinary model for all of us, Dr. Dylan Rodriguez. Dylan is a teacher, scholar, organizer, and collaborator who has maintained a day job as a professor at the University of California, Riverside since 2001. Dylan was elected president of the American Studies Association by his peers in 2020. And in that same year, he was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars. A widely published, highly awarded scholar, Dylan's life work focuses on liberationist, anti-colonial, and abolitionist confrontations with the anti-Black, colonial, and white supremacist violences that permeate the ongoing civilization project. He's devoted to studying and teaching the historical collective genius of rebellion, survival, and insurgent futurity that radically challenge dominant forms of authority, power, and institutionality. He appreciates participating in all forms of collective study, thought, and planning that build capacities to survive and revolt against oppressive conditions. Dylan, we are grateful to be able to welcome you here today to do some of that capacity building work with organizers and educators in this struggle against genocide and for liberation.
Thank you, Sabina, as always, for inviting me. I want to make sure sound check that I'm sounding all right.
You sound great.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay, good. Hey, nice to meet all you all virtually. As fraught as that is, I'm Dylan. He, him pronouns. I'm Filipino. I got short hair. Wearing a beige fake barong that's cheap. It's from the Chunga. Filipinos here will know Chunga is like the swap meet in the Philippines. So the cheap version of a barong, but still looks kind of cool. And I'm mostly have a look of gratitude on my face because Sabina's inviting me into the fight. So that's the thing I probably treasure the most. I need to put that in my bio from now on, that I treasure being invited into the fight. So this is where we are. And Sabina, I want to thank you and the whole team that just pulled us together to do this, I think, really urgent set of dialogues, conversations, and hopefully catalyzing activity and study together in these times of ongoing genocide. It's accelerated, yes, but it's an ongoing genocidal context that we're in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, we want to open it up for you to share your just extraordinary wealth of knowledge. I know you've been involved sort of intensively in talks and actions on this U.S.-Israeli genocide, longstanding occupation and colonization, and the movements for liberation. And so I don't know if you want to start with that work and share with us some of the things you think are important for organizers and educators to hear, to focus on, or take it in any direction you wish.
Yeah, I'll just share with you all the way I think entering this particular moment within this particular struggle. I believe that I am um, a mercenary presence in the best way. Like, I don't mean that in a pathologizing way. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that in the I'm saying that we're in a condition of we're calling it genocide now. It's been genocide. I think it's time to say that, because I'm hearing a lot of people who have for a long time refused to use conditions in which people are being neutralized and liquidated, and in some cases that are now using the term genocide. So because of the profound conditions that we're observing happen in Gaza. The genocide's been an ongoing thing. It's been concentrated, accelerated. Now, it's been an ongoing thing. This shit didn't just start 2 weeks ago. So as far as, like, I'm in a room with leaders of all kinds, I think we need to start teaching that. I think we need to start teaching, number one, that if we can understand that what is happening these last couple of weeks in Gaza is like, it's an absolute atrocity. I think we need to try to resist relying on the language of human rights and the United Nations to describe what is happening, much less to seek some form of reparation for what's happening. I think we need to refrain from that. I think we need to use the language of liberation. It needs to be a language of liberation. We need to go back to the tools that many of us have cultivated over many years. For many of us, it's decades. We need to go back to Fanon. You know what I'm saying? We need to go back to Du Bois. We need to go back to Ida B. Wells. We need to go back to all of the revolutionary thinkers with whom we are most intimate and familiar, and take their fucking words seriously in various contexts. Understand the ways in which their militancy, their revolutionary commitment can and should be understood as portable, as translatable. And I'm not, I'm not saying that we need to conflate struggles here. What I am saying is that the militancy with which people are devoted to revolution and the messiness that happens within that militancy is something to be embraced, not avoided, not sterilized. The messiness needs to be embraced. We're in a moment like that now. So I'm going to say that to start. And I'm also going to say this. Part of what I'm seeing happen in real time is a form of psyops, a form of what the military used to call asymmetric warfare. They don't use that term as much nowadays, apparently. I've been reading up on what the military does, right? But they use the term asymmetric warfare. They used to use the term asymmetric warfare to describe precisely what is happening now with the deployment of the term anti-Semitism to start actively coming for people. So not at this point, it's more than just a kind of ideological trick. It's more than just a kind of rhetorical ploy. It's actually what one could refer to as a direct form of waging war in the context of asymmetric war. And this is a kind of extra state asymmetric war. That's what asymmetric war is, by the way. It's when a war is waged by organizations and people that are not necessarily part of the military or part of the state. So you have this Institute for the Holocaust, the IHRA. The IHRA infamously has this definition of anti-Semitism. It is now being adopted by various organizations, from universities to public schools to city councils, and it is being used as a way to directly repress political activity and, frankly, to repress thought. So everything that, by the way, everything that has created this moment that how many of us are here right now? Like something like 90 of us are here, right? This 90-ish of us are here. This is, by definition, what we're doing here is anti-Semitic. Just so y'all know, right? If we're in an institutional context that had fully adopted the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, then we would be in violation. So that's what I'm talking. It's more than just a rhetorical ploy. It's actually a way of engaging in the work that a lot of us understand through other terms, like COINTELPRO, right? COINTELPRO did similar things by way of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. So when you look at what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is doing and the way it's circulated through Anti-Defamation League and all these other organizations, the way in which there's an exception around the genocidal settler colonial practice, not just ideology, but the practice of Zionism, then what we're talking about is a kind of sweeping apparatus that is genocidal in its form, genocidal in its conduct, genocidal in its context. And I got some other things that I'll talk about, but let me start there and see if y'all want to think about anything together.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about both things you brought up. So one is, in our last conversation, you and Connie and I talked about this sort of the framing of violence. And I think there's a relationship between the framing of violence and nonviolence in these contexts and in the conversation we're having around abolition. So I wonder if you wanted to talk more about Fanon, and you wanted to talk more about how violence itself is getting framed similarly as is anti-Semitism, as you said, this sort of asymmetric use of ideas and frames and terms that then, you know, are meant to sort of enclose or contain people, their counterinsurgent, anti-revolutionary measures. So it seems like there's a connection between the use of violence and the use of anti-Semitism in this sort of attempt to shut down. And that's statist and not and sort of collusion through citizens of states, but it's relevant to Biden's recent efforts to suppress speech, and certainly experiences we had with our administration trying to put together this event.
Yeah. So let me say a couple of things about this, and especially thinking about our last conversation, and particularly about what I understand to be the most urgent imperatives of the long abolitionist kind of tradition of praxis as it's been articulated throughout the Black diaspora of you know, the Black diasporic rebellion, revolt, revolutionary struggle, and so forth. One of the foundational connections between different sites of liberation struggle is actually found in the unspoken ways in which kind of hegemonic communities of liberals, people who see themselves as on the side of justice, for example, people who see themselves as on the side of freedom and civil rights and even self-determination. So they're liberals in the sense that they believe that those things can be done without like a really foundational disruption of existing systems. So like they think that somehow it's magical thinking. Liberalism to me is magical thinking, right? So we'll like move from that understanding that liberalism is a kind of deadly magical thinking. It's not innocent magical thinking. But the things that liberalism has in common in this particular context, and thinking about Gaza, and then thinking about the constant imperative, the kind of compulsory imperative to condemn Hamas before you can talk about anything else, right? The imperative to prioritize the mourning of Israeli civilian life before you can mention Palestinian existence. Okay, that's compulsory at this point. It's a requirement. I'm talking about among liberals. I'm not talking about the right wing. I'm talking about among the spectrum of liberals, from the kind of mushy center to the progressive left. This is compulsory. Okay, so what does this mean about liberalism? Well, what I'm going to say is that in periods of insurrection and revolt, in which oppressed, incarcerated, occupied peoples, including the recent what do you call it? Experiments of insurrection that happened throughout North America, right? That were pivoting on a deep and radical confrontation with the foundational anti-Blackness of the nation state, whether it's Canada, the US, or something else, right? And I'm talking about nation state, you know, local government, whatever, police departments, all right? You saw a similar kind of thing happen, sometimes within the movements, and oftentimes pushed by people who understood themselves to be militants, right? But it was a kind of compulsory attachment to what I'm going to call an unnamed pacifism, not tactical nonviolence, right? But an unnamed pacifism. So it's in periods like this of both accelerated occupation and militarization that is tantamount to immediate genocidal activity and revolt, in which pacifism tells on itself. In other words, it reveals itself. The delusions of liberalism reveal themselves. And part of the delusion is fueled by this unspoken pacifism. And by pacifism, what I'm talking about is a kind of belief that people who are oppressed need to adhere to a particular kind of script when they engage in resistance, right? That militant resistance and militant desire and struggle for freedom, liberation, and really just to repulse an occupier. All right. So like the definition of colonialism is, of a certain version of colonialism means that you are occupied. So part of what happens is that there's a struggle and there's conflict and there's disagreement. But one of the imperatives for occupied people is to try to calculate how to get rid of an occupier, to stop the occupation. If we look at the historical sweep of how at least momentarily successful revolts against occupation and apartheid have worked, that has meant a certain kind of messiness of violence in which people die. There's guerrilla actions that get taken. People call it terrorism now. What's interesting is this as well, actually, when we talk about the condemnations of terrorism, I think hopefully people here are on the same page that, we all hopefully recognize that, yeah, Hamas gets called terrorist. The work that the Israeli state in conjunction with the US state is not called terrorist, right? That's just self-defense, whatever the fuck that means, right? So we already, hopefully we can kind of just agree on kind of the incompatibility and hypocrisy of that distinction. However, I want to trace it back and think about, that period in the 20th century when there were kind of ongoing global anti-colonial struggles, revolts, and revolutions that involved guerrilla warfare, involved all various forms of struggle and counter struggle to try to eradicate occupation, to try to eradicate colonial relationships. Guerrilla warfare was obviously a central part of how people undertook that because, colonized people were vastly underarmed, vastly under-militarized compared to these dominant powers. So they engaged in guerrilla warfare. During that period of time, the notion of terrorism was just understood to be a tactic. It didn't have this thing attached to it that's happened over the last 50 or 60 years, in which it's automatically attached to, brown, Arab, Muslim, especially Palestinian resistors, regardless of whatever their ideological position is, regardless of whether they're part of Hamas or a different organization. So it's to say that when we think about the violence of an ordinary condition, then part of what the kind of ideology and the magical thinking of pacifism does is it deludes one into believing that you can prescribe to the oppressed formula and limitations for how they are allowed to undertake their own liberation, right? And you're also allowed to kind of judge how their own internal contradictions and struggles play out, which is also what we are seeing in Gaza and Palestine. I'm tired of having to remind people, others have said this, but what's happening in Gaza right now, it's what they would call under the war crime statutes, it's called collective punishment, right? You have one particular organization that undertakes a military activity that the world's calling terrorism, killing Israeli civilians, taking hostages, etc. And now the entire population is being held responsible for that by way of a genocidal military activity. So I think pacifism usually hides itself, but I think there's ways it is telling on itself. So as educators, as people who think analytically, who think pedagogically, and who think militantly, we need to name the pacifism. And here's the last thing I'll say about this point. I'm actually all right with it in a way if people will just admit it, right? Like if people will just admit that they're pacifists. If people will just admit they're pacifists, then you're actually telling me that we're talking about capacity building, right? Then what you're telling me is that our capacity building is going to be very limited. Okay, but let's be honest, right? If you're telling me you're a pacifist, it means you are not going to defend the people who are in the street trying to push back against the anti-blackness of the state by destroying property and destroying police stations, right? I know you're probably not going to defend that, right? I will defend that. I'm not a pacifist. I try to kill the pacifist that's inside of me. The state that's inside of me is whatever. That's haunts me all the time too. But I try to kill the pacifist inside of me. One way I can do that is to tell you, I will defend the right of people to experiment militantly, including experiments in violence, because that is what the historical text teaches us. The archive teaches us. There's no escaping those experiments and the messiness of the mistakes and the failures of those experiments, the atrocities that happen, usually internal ones, with those experiments, right? I'm saying that's what we need to understand. Let's just call out the magical thinking and let's get the pacifists to admit they're pacifists. That way we can be on the same page about what our limitations are together.
Yeah, I so appreciate how just always brilliantly you help us all sort of articulate and therefore better observe all the complex dynamics. I wonder, you brought up this sort of international law and collective punishment, and I wonder about that tension and messiness. So I wonder if you can help people think about how, if we're anti and decolonial and we're understanding these multinational organizations, a part of the colonial project, a part of the long genocidal project, how do we then think about engaging with their laws? So, you're resisting the quote unquote Israeli state in all it's done and this current genocide, but then we mobilize, international law. Where are those tensions, and are there ways to help people on this call think beyond that, to kind of resist, again, the magical liberal humanitarian international bodies?
Yeah, we got to understand the UN as a fucking cop. That's what the United Nations is. These international bodies, they are a police body, which means you have to deal with them as a police body. So I'm not saying that to be cute. I'm saying that that is like part of a strategic framework. So to say that there are moments where you have to deal with, if you're talking in certain circumstances that we can give specificity. We can talk about specific examples all day, but there are specific situations in which, your people, your community, your collective, your organization, whatever, you might be forced into a kind of negotiation with these bodies, including police bodies, right? Especially if they're, if in the case of Gaza, if what you're trying to figure out is how to instigate at least a momentary ceasefire so your people can fucking live, all right? So it's a defensive stature, but that's the nature of guerrilla war too, okay? So there's no shame in that. It's just a recognition of the situation. So these international bodies, they are police bodies. They're literally there to police a global order. We see it play out consistently. They're not on the side of liberation. They're not only not on the side of anti-colonialism, they're against it, and they'll appropriate the terms of decolonization to fight off anti-colonialism. So that's the distinction I wanted to draw conceptually for us as teachers and educators. I think that we need to have a necessary distinction between anti-colonialism and decolonization. Anti-colonialism is a moment of destructivity, right? Anti-colonialism means you are destroying the colonial apparatus. That's what anti-colonialism is. And depending on who you read and who you attach yourself to, anti-colonialism is the condition of possibility, is the precursor for whatever the fuck it is that we're going to call decolonization. The problem is that people want to skip that step. I'm being somewhat simplistic, schematic, but not that simplistic or schematic, right? If people want to skip the step of, again, the messiness, the violence, the suffering, the misery, and also the joy, the beauty, the collective militancy, the emboldenment, the feelings of invincibility that come from the anti-colonial struggle. They want to go right to decolonization. You know what? The UN is happy to do that. The World Bank is happy to do that. Fucking Microsoft and Chevron, they're happy. They would love to work with you on decolonizing all kinds of shit. The university, nobody loves decolonization more than the university, not to mention academics, right? So I'll say, as far as our pedagogical work, our strategic and organizing work, to treat these international bodies as a police apparatus is to treat them as, they're there to work as a kind of leverage point for immediate things that you might need to survive, to stave off destruction. They're not going to be the kind of body that you go to for reparation or whatever you want, for reparation, for liberation, whatever. It's no different than dealing with a prison administration, like when incarcerated people go on strike. Right? They oftentimes the point of it is to deal with the prison administration. They're under no illusions that the prison administration is going to let them out of prison, at least most of the time, most strikes that I've studied anyways, right? And so there's a recognition of that. So when incarcerated people strike, whether it's Pelican Bay, whether it was the ones in Georgia, whether it's the nationwide ones that have happened over the last 10 years, there's a recognition. This is the prison administration we're dealing with. There are certain negotiations that we can have with them to try to make more room for ourselves so that we can survive these hellholes of state prisons. There's no delusion that these are going to be the administrations that free us. Okay. Same thing with universities, although I think there's less of a recognition that university administrations are not going to free anybody. They're not going to meet the standard of liberatory and anti-colonial work, much less authentic decolonization. So I think we need to take that analysis forward. beyond just internationalized, we need to take that metaphor into universities, school districts, et cetera. The administrations are there to retain order. And as I've been saying for the last few years, since I've been involved with the South Campus movement, university and college administrations in particular are usually the chiefs of the chief of police, right? So it's not even an abstraction. They're actually the police chief is a direct report to the university president or chancellor. So treat them that way. That's why I tell my friends and colleagues that I work with, is like, stop hoping that folks in the administration are going to have your back or somehow be on the side of liberation. There's even if they're your friends, it's they know, they will tell you if they're honest with you that yeah, my job is basically to be a fucking warden or an assistant warden. I think that brings a lot of kind of clarity to the way that we think about capacity building. And it also demystifies a lot of that kind of magical liberal hope that that we sometimes catch ourselves in, even if we call ourselves something else than liberal.
Yeah. And I want to say here, you've spoken and written about this brilliantly, the piece on the Ford Foundation, this sort of dastardly DEI installation of Black and brown administrators who will speak equity and justice, but will do the cop work. And this sort of, I think, mind fuck for students in particular. Faculty, I feel shouldn't be that dumb. But students get confused, and it's a real travesty. I also don't really want to spend a lot of our time talking about it, because I think it's one of the ways we recentering the university pulls us away from just using the university to do the kind of work you've been doing your whole life. And I want to keep us there with that work. I want to ask you if I'm sure that people on this call are interested in thinking about that anti-colonial work, sort of what is that that moment or that possibility right now. I'm looking here to see what you called it, the sort of destroying the colonial apparatus is the moment where you create the condition of possibility. That's what it is. How can people on this call think about being in this moment of creating together a condition of possibility? What is this sort of anti-colonial call of the moment? I heard you say clearly, and I want to repeat, people need to study like that and
yes,
go to the Fanon and all of that. And
you know what, you just named it. So Sabina, you just named it, and I'm hearing this, by the way, so I'm following the lead of my Palestinian comrades who've been involved in the struggle for years. Palestinian youth movement, Palestinian feminist organizations, et cetera. So folks that I'm close to and that I really deeply trust in their guidance. And what a lot of folks are saying to me and others, so I'm gonna say to y'all, is that they're calling for as much knowledge production and circulation and teach-ins just like this, actually. They're saying do as much of that work as you possibly can right now, right? Because it's a major front in this ongoing kind of colonial and genocidal occupation and so-called war. I'm not sure if it's really a war, but it's also a front in trying to create room for actual liberation struggle and anti-colonial possibilities. Part of that is to just name what is happening, and you see that the other side, right, the side that is accustomed to Zionism going unnamed, right, Zionism being the exceptional political ideology that can never be critiqued because it's conflated with anti-Semitism, which thankfully a lot of our anti-Zionist Jewish comrades, liberation warriors and friends are consistently directly challenging. I think the thing that we can do is precisely more things like this. And the side of Zionism recognizes how effective this is because they're trying to stop it. And they're trying to retaliate against those of us who engage in these conversations in an unapologetic and militant and very clarifying way that understands analytically and rhetorically what the stakes are, right? So I think, so they're freaking out. They're scrambling. Like the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, like a Zionist organization, they're sending directives to all kinds of organizations and administrations around the United States, like telling them, here's how you deal with it when people are saying solidarity with Palestine, right? So I think the more we can engage in direct analysis, kind of knowledge circulation and teaching about what Zionism is as a genocidal ideology and platform and kind of vision of colonial occupation, which is what it is, has nothing to do with with the Jewish faith. The Judaism has nothing to do with that. And the more we can articulate unapologetic solidarity with Palestinian existence at this moment, right? Hopefully we can get to Palestinian liberation I'm saying Palestinian existence, because that is the stakes right now. Palestinian existence is the stakes right now. And again, the side of Zionism is trying to criminalize unapologetic solidarity with just the bareness of Palestinian existence. All right. So like I'm following the lead of my colleagues and comrades who are saying we need to be saying that collectively, consistently, unapologetically. And you know what? Tactically too, because some of us can take the hit that's going to come from all this shit like more than others. So I'm down for that. Like I'm down to take that. I actually take a lot of joy in being the target of some of this stuff. I really do.
Yeah, exactly. And there are those of us who should. I think you said so many things. One thing I want to repeat for everyone is that you said several times, I'm following the lead of Palestinian colleagues, of Palestinian organizers. And I think this is a conversation I've had with so many people, with some people who are on this call. You know, when we go to a rally, we don't add our little twist to the chant. They chant, we chant back. It's an absolute response. When people ask us to repost, we repost. We don't add a paragraph. And I think this is such an important point for academics in particular, that we have to both step up and step aside so that we're following the lead, doing what we're asked, and not always needing to add our piece to it. And I think that's following the practice that's as old as rallies themselves, right? One person calls through the megaphone, the rest of us repeat. And I think if we can do that in all of these ways, if we're being asked to do these things, to do what we're being asked, and I think it makes space. I mean, I know, like, I got shadow banned because I think I was never on social media before, and so then all of a sudden, so, it's easy to find me. So then don't post about anything else, right? So if we're posting about other things and our Gaza or Palestine posts are getting shadow banned, then it just looks like nobody's posting and everybody can feel like nobody's posting. So it seems like there are these collective ways we can do really basic following of the lead, as you said, but I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I know my time with y'all is almost up, but let me just say one thing in preparation for immediate preparation, something that I think teachers and of all kinds need to get behind. Something called the Hawley Amendment passed last week in the Senate. It's a resolution, so it's legally binding, but it is kind of intended to be guidance. And what it essentially is doing, it's setting things up for a selective kind of persecution and prosecution of people that are engaged in pro-Palestine and Palestine solidarity work, and especially Palestinian students and Palestinian people generally inside the United States, right? So I think all of us need to prepare strategies and we need to establish networks of communication with Palestinian students, teachers, staff people at the places that we work in our communities. Because SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine in particular, is a target of this. I think we are looking down the barrel of various police collaborations and probably administrative collaborations as well that are going to begin to essentially kidnap and arrest SJP students. I think that is on the immediate horizon. I think there will probably be like an experimental test of trying to do that to a particularly militant SJP organization somewhere. And I think the intent is for it to metastasize and to start becoming a kind of a regular practice. Not unlike, what has happened in COINTELPRO with what they did to the Panthers and other organizations, not unlike what happened after 9/11 in various communities and whatnot. So, these things they're different, right? But I'm saying that the technologies of criminalization and kidnapping are deeply related to each other. So I think we're looking at that. I think we need to prepare for that. We need to look at that and have a way to talk about it now in preparation, in anticipation, and to do it publicly, to whatever extent you want to interpret my term public, but to do it openly, maybe I should say, to do it openly. So we need to share this awareness, this knowledge, and mobilize. I think it's about that kind of mobilization right now.
I know that you are at American Studies and have to go. We've kept you 5 minutes past time, and I really appreciate you wrapping us up with thinking about mobilizing for others and being collaborative. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you
Hey,
always.
Sabina, so I want to say I love you very much.
I love you
And thank
too,
you.
Dylan. Yeah, thank you. I just you're amazing.
Yeah.
We're
Thank you for
lucky.
giving me some. Hey, I'm sorry for taking extra time, but hopefully
No.
y'all can go a little bit. Okay, so by the way, I'm gonna post my email real quick before I log off, so folks can hit me up if they need
Great.
to.
Great. We appreciate
Okay,
your,
there it is.
thank you. Thank you so very much.
Oh,
Thank
my
you.
bad. I typed it wrong. Sorry.
Thank you all for
There it is.
joining
That's
us.
right. Thank you. All right, I'll talk to you soon.
We'll see you on Monday at 2. Take good care, Dylan.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Everyone, thank you so much. We'll be back Monday at 2 with an organizer on the ground, Sharif Sakut. We're so looking forward to our conversation. Thank you for being here today.